The chair scraped softly against the cafe floor as Margaret lowered herself into it, her hands trembling not from the cold December air outside, but from the weight of embarrassment she had learned to carry everywhere. She had almost turned back when she saw the polished wood tables, the soft lights, the quiet confidence of people who looked like they belonged to a different world than hers. But her feet betrayed her pride and moved forward anyway. Have you ever stood somewhere and felt your entire life reduced to what you could afford, to what you deserved, to whether you were invisible or not? What if this happened to you, on a day when hope already felt thin? If you were in her place, would you have walked away? Or would you have sat down and prayed no one noticed you were out of place? It was Christmas week in a small city in Ohio, and the cafe sat across from a glass tower that housed one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the Midwest. Margaret did not know that, just as she did not know the man sitting across from her would change the course of her life. She only knew she had spent the last 3 hours walking from one church pantry to another, gathering what little she could to make Christmas feel real for her 8-year-old son back home. Her husband, Thomas, had died 2 winters earlier in a highway accident, and since then, life had become a quiet endurance of bills, rejection letters, and nights where sleep came only after tears. She had stepped into the cafe because it was warm, because the sign said anyone was welcome, and because for 5 minutes she wanted to feel like a person again, not a problem. Across the table sat Jonathan, a man whose tailored suit and calm posture marked him as someone accustomed to being listened to. He was the CEO of the very building outside, though today he was not thinking about quarterly reports or shareholders. Christmas had always been complicated for him. Raised by a mother who cleaned offices at night and a father who left early, he had promised himself that success would protect him from pain. Yet here he was, 42 years old, financially untouchable, and emotionally hollow. He had come to the cafe after a board meeting that felt louder than it should have, looking for quiet, looking for something unnamed. When he noticed Margaret sit down, he felt an irrational irritation, the kind that rises when your carefully controlled world is disturbed. The seat across from him was usually reserved for investors or colleagues. Without realizing it, he had assumed it was for the rich. Margaret stared into her untouched coffee, calculating whether she could leave without drawing attention. Her coat was worn, her shoes scuffed, and she could feel judgment pressing in from every direction, even if no one was actually looking. She wondered if this was how Mary felt, heavy with fear, turned away again and again. She whispered a prayer without words, asking only to be invisible until she could leave. Jonathan, watching her from the corner of his eye, noticed the way her shoulders curved inward, as if she were trying to fold herself smaller. Something about it tugged at him, stirring a memory he had buried deep of his mother sitting on a bus with her head down, pretending not to hear the whispers. The silence between them grew thick, and in it Jonathan felt something crack. He realized he had been wrong, not just about the seat, but about so many quiet assumptions he carried like facts. He had built an empire on efficiency and profit, but here, in the middle of a Christmas-decorated cafe, he saw inefficiency in the human heart, how easy it was to dismiss someone without knowing their story. He thought of all the meetings where people were reduced to numbers, of all the times he had said, "Not my problem." For the first time in years, he felt ashamed. Margaret, sensing his gaze, lifted her eyes, bracing for dismissal, for that familiar look that said, "You don't belong." Instead, she saw uncertainty, and then something gentler. Jonathan stood, walked to the counter, and returned with another cup of coffee and a small plate of pastries, setting them down without ceremony. He did not announce generosity or expect gratitude, he simply acted. Margaret's eyes filled, not because of the food, but because of the dignity in the gesture. No one had done something so ordinary and kind for her in a long time. She felt seen, and that feeling was almost unbearable. If kindness can hurt, this was how it felt, like a bruise pressed after too long. They sat there, sharing space without words, and in that quiet, something holy passed between them. Jonathan learned, not through a sermon or a success story, but through presence, that wealth had nothing to do with worth. Margaret learned that not all doors were closed, that sometimes grace arrived wearing an unfamiliar face. Outside, snow began to fall, softening the city, making everything look new. Jonathan thought about his company's empty conference rooms and unused holiday budget, about the power he held and how rarely he used it to heal. Margaret thought about her son Samuel, and how she would tell him that Christmas miracles were not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they were just a warm chair and a stranger's mercy. In the days that followed, Jonathan made choices that startled those around him. He expanded a local outreach program, funded job training, and quietly ensured Margaret had work that respected her dignity and paid enough to breathe. He did not do it to feel better about himself, though it did change him. He did it because something true had been revealed to him at that table, something he could not unsee. Margaret, stepping into a new rhythm of life, carried the memory of that day like a candle, lighting her way through fear and doubt. She no longer believed that seats were reserved for the rich, only that some people had forgotten who they were meant for. Christmas morning came bright and cold, and in homes across the city, people opened gifts and returned to their lives. But for two people who had shared a silent moment in a café, the season marked a turning point. One learned that power without compassion was empty. The other learned that humility did not mean invisibility. And somewhere between loss and abundance, both found something closer to faith than they had known before. Before the story ends, take a moment and tell us in the comments what this moment stirred in you, because your reflection matters more than you think. If this story truly touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, not out of habit, but as a small act of kindness that keeps stories like this alive, reminding us all that sometimes the most powerful truths are learned in the quietest seats.